My husband took everything in the divorce. At least that was the lie he believed, as he stood in the middle of a crowded pediatric waiting room, looking at me with a coldness that could have frozen the very air in our lungs, while the fluorescent lights above us hummed like a chorus of dying stars, and I stood there holding my son Leo's hand, feeling the small tremors of his anxiety through his palm as he looked up at me with those wide, trusting eyes that still struggled to understand why the world was becoming so quiet. And I realized in that precise moment of public humiliation that the man I had shared a bed with for 7 years was nothing more than a well-dressed predator who had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike at my neck. I was 33 years old, a senior forensic auditor whose entire career was built on the meticulous deconstruction of financial lies. But I had been so busy protecting the foundation of my family that I hadn't noticed the rot he had been injecting into the support beams of my own life. And as I looked at the manila envelope he had just shoved into my chest, I felt the weight of every sacrifice I had ever made for him, every late night I had spent balancing the books for his failing real estate company, Apex Holdings, and every dream I had deferred so he could play the role of the visionary mogul while I played the role of the silent anchor. The clinic was quiet except for the muffled sound of a cartoon playing on a television in the corner and the soft rhythmic tapping of a nurse's keyboard. But Preston's voice cut through the space like a serrated blade as he told me he was filing for divorce and that he had already emptied the joint medical savings account we had built for Leo's cochlear implant surgery because he had decided that our 6-year-old son's hearing loss was a financial shipwreck and a bad investment that he was no longer willing to subsidize with his hard-earned capital. He said it with such casual cruelty that the receptionist gasped, and I felt a hot surge of protective fury rise in my throat. But I didn't let it break my composure, because a forensic auditor knows that emotion is just noise in the data, and I needed to keep my mind clear to track the movement of the theft he had just committed against his own child. He told me that his mistress Kendall was waiting for him in the Porsche Carrera outside, and that I had 48 hours to vacate the Aspen mansion before the locks were changed, and the security team arrived to escort me and my defective baggage to the curb, while he began his new life with a woman who didn't come with the heavy emotional overhead of a disabled child and a wife who knew too much about his accounting practices. I looked down at the paper in the envelope, seeing the bold letters of the divorce decree and the specific clauses he had drafted to strip me of the investment portfolios, the luxury vehicles, and the equity in the home I had paid for with my own bonuses. And I realized that he had spent months preparing this ambush while I was busy taking Leo to speech therapy and researching the best surgeons in the country to give him back his voice. Preston laughed when he saw the look on my face, a sharp, jagged sound that held no warmth, and told me that I was a fool for thinking that my loyalty would ever be worth more than his bottom line. And then he turned his back on us, walking out of the clinic with the swagger of a man who believed he had just won the greatest negotiation of his life, without realizing that he had just handed me the very evidence I needed to destroy him. I sat down on the hard plastic chair of the waiting room, my heart hammering against my ribs, like a trapped bird as Leo touched my cheek and signed the word for mother with a question in his eyes. And I had to swallow the bile in my throat before I could find the strength to sign back that everything was going to be okay, even though I knew the balance in our medical account was now 0, and the surgery scheduled for that afternoon was officially canceled, because the man who should have been Leo's protector had decided to treat him like a depreciating asset. I didn't cry because I knew that tears were a luxury I couldn't afford, and I needed to save every ounce of my energy for the audit that was about to begin. So I dat Leo out to my 10-year-old sedan and drove straight to my sister Savannah's house, where the air smelled of cocoa butter and protection. And I sat at her kitchen table while her husband, Trey, who is a special agent for the IRS, looked at the papers I had pulled from my hidden backup drive. Trey didn't say a word for nearly 20 minutes, his eyes moving rapidly across the spreadsheets and the loan documents I had been quietly collecting for months. And when he finally looked up, his face was grim, and his voice was a low rumble of suppressed rage as he told me that Preston hadn't just been stealing from me, but had been forging my signature on a $5 million commercial bridge loan to fund his crypto gambling and a series of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands that were now in the red. Because Preston was so arrogant and so determined to prove that I was nothing without him, he had insisted on a divorce decree that granted him 100% ownership of Apex Holdings under an as-is clause, which meant he was legally assuming every single cent of that $5 million debt and every single fraudulent transaction he had ever authorized in my name without realizing that I was already filing for innocent spouse relief with the federal government. He thought he was taking the house and the cars and the prestige, but he was actually taking the liability for a lifetime of financial crimes. And I was going to let him do it because I knew that the only way to save my son was to let his father drown in the very gold he had stolen from us. Before I tell you what happened when I met with my lawyer, Mr. Harrison, and the strange request I made for a worthless red painting that Preston kept in the garage, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they were the smartest person in the room, only to realize that you were the one holding all the keys? Let me know in the comments where you are watching from today, because I am reading every single one of your stories, and they are the fuel for my fire. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-focused calm, moving my grandmother's heirloom jewelry to a secure vault, and packing Leo's clothes into cardboard boxes, while the shadows of the Aspen mansion felt like they were closing in on me. But I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like an auditor who was finally closing a long and painful case. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, called me 6 times that evening, her voice dripping with a fake sympathy that was actually a thin veil for her fear that I would do something to embarrass the family name, and she told me that I should just sign the papers and go quietly, because Preston was a man of great ambition, and I was just a woman who had become too obsessed with the medical bills of a child who was never going to be perfect. I told her that she was right and that Preston deserved exactly what was coming to him, and then I hung up and blocked her number because I realized that her grace was just as hollow as her son's, and they both deserved to see how quickly a house of cards falls when the foundation finally decides to walk away. I met Mr. Harrison in a quiet wood-paneled office the next morning, and I didn't ask for the mansion or the cars or the alimony. I just asked for the exclusive ownership of a modern art painting titled The Crimson Blur, and for Preston to sign a waiver of financial discovery so we could settle the divorce in record time. Mr. Harrison looked at me like I had lost my mind and asked me why I was giving up millions of dollars for a piece of canvas that looked like a crime scene. But I just smiled and told him that Preston's ego wouldn't let him walk away from a fight, and if he thought that painting was valuable, he would fight me for it, and in the process he would sign away his right to ever look at the books again. It was a Trojan horse strategy designed by a woman who had spent a decade finding the hidden traps in other people's contracts. And I knew Preston wouldn't be able to resist the urge to win one last time against the wife he thought was broken. By the time I reached the bank to print out the final statements of the emptied account, I felt a cold, unshakable resolve that I had never known before, because I realized that my husband hadn't just taken everything in the divorce. He had taken the noise and the lies and the weight of a man who didn't deserve to hear my son's voice, and in return, I was going to give him the absolute silence of a prison cell and a debt that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The story was just beginning, and as I looked at my reflection in the glass door of the bank, I didn't see an exhausted provider. I saw a matriarch who was finally reclaiming her crown, and I knew that by the time the audit was finished, there would be nothing left of Preston Williams but a cautionary tale about what happens when you try to break the woman who was the only thing holding you up. I drove back to the small apartment on the south side and began to build my war room, knowing that the next move was mine and it was going to be cinematic. The south side apartment felt like a tomb of memories draped in the gray dust of a life I had once fought to escape, and now found myself retreating into like a wounded soldier, seeking the only shelter left on a scorched battlefield, while the radiator hissed a rhythmic, mournful sound that echoed the silence of my son's world. And every 15 minutes, the house shook with the violent vibration of the L train screaming past the window, as if to remind me that the world was still moving, even if my own heart had stopped in that pediatric clinic. I spent the first 48 hours in a state of clinical dissociation, sitting at my grandmother's scarred mahogany table, with my laptop glowing in the dark like a lighthouse in a sea of rising debt, while I meticulously mapped the digital bloodstains Preston had left across the accounts of Apex Holdings, because he was a man who believed that if he deleted a file, it ceased to exist, failing to realize that a forensic auditor lives in the metadata and the shadows of deleted entries. My sister Savannah arrived on the second night, her arms full of plastic bags that smelled of slow-cooked greens and cornbread and the kind of deep ancestral comfort that only a woman who shares your blood can provide. And she didn't say a word as she set the containers down on the cracked linoleum, because she knew that I wasn't ready to be touched or pitied, lest I shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. She brought her husband, Trey, who sat across from me with his heavy leather briefcase and the quiet, somber authority of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. And as we ate the dinner Savannah had prepared in near silence, I watched the steam rise from the food and felt the first flicker of heat returning to my fingers. Trey opened his laptop and showed me the red flags that were already beginning to pop up in the federal system, because Preston's crypto gambling hadn't just been a private failure, but had triggered a series of automated alerts regarding suspicious offshore transfers and a $5 million commercial bridge loan that had been flagged for an immediate audit due to the discrepancies in the signatures. I explained to Trey that Preston had spent years telling me I was too emotional and too focused on the domestic details of our life to understand the complexities of his visionary business dealings, a narrative that he had carefully constructed to keep me away from the books, while I was actually the one providing the secret stability that kept the creditors from his door. I showed Trey the emails I had archived, where Preston explicitly forbade me from accessing the corporate accounts, and the recordings I had made of him mocking my professional intellect, because those were the cornerstones of my innocent spouse relief application that would prove I was a non-participant in his financial fraud. Trey looked at the evidence and let out a long, slow whistle of disbelief, telling me that Preston had essentially built his own gallows and was now asking me to help him tighten the rope by demanding a divorce settlement that granted him absolute control over the very entities that were about to be seized by the government. I told them that I was going to give him exactly what he wanted, and that I was going to play the role of the broken, defeated woman so perfectly that his narcissistic ego would be too blinded by the glare of his own victory to see the legal trapdoor I was installing beneath his feet. I met with my lawyer, Mr. Harrison, the next morning in a space that smelled of old law books and expensive cigar smoke, and I sat there in a faded sweater and no makeup, looking like a woman who had lost her grip on reality, while I instructed him to draft a counter-proposal that focused entirely on a worthless red painting titled The Crimson Blur, which Preston had bought during a drunken weekend in Miami and currently used as a coaster in the garage. I told Harrison to make it seem like I was obsessed with this painting, like I believed it was my only hope for a financial future, because I knew that Preston's competitive nature wouldn't allow him to let me have anything I actually valued. And if he thought that painting was worth something, he would fight for it with the tenacity of a starving dog over a bone. The key to the entire strategy was the waiver of financial discovery and the as-is clause, because if Preston signed those documents, he was legally declaring that he was satisfied with the state of the assets and was voluntarily assuming all liabilities associated with them, which would lock him into the $5 million debt and the fraud charges, while I walked away with my name scrubbed clean by the federal government. Savannah asked me if I could really handle the humiliation of him thinking he had destroyed me, and I looked at her with the cold eyes of a woman who had already died once and realized that being underestimated is the greatest tactical advantage a woman in my position can possess. Preston arrived at the apartment on Thursday afternoon, his polished leather shoes looking grotesque against the worn carpet of the hallway, and he didn't even step inside before he started mocking the smallness of my new life and the smell of the radiator as he waved the settlement papers in the air like a flag of conquest. I let my shoulders slump, and I made my voice tremble as I begged him for the surgery money and for the red painting, claiming that I had a spiritual connection to the art and that it was the only thing that gave me peace in the darkness of his betrayal. He laughed, a sound that was so filled with toxic triumph that I could almost taste the bitterness of it in the back of my throat, and he told me that I was a pathetic shell of a woman who was trading a mansion for a piece of trash because I was too weak to handle the real world of business. He signed the papers with a flourish of his gold pen, thinking he was robbing me of my last asset while he was actually signing away his freedom and his future, because he had just legally confirmed his sole responsibility for the $5 million forgery and the offshore tax evasion that Trey was preparing to testify about. He looked at me one last time with a sneer of absolute contempt and told me that he was going to hang that painting in the foyer of the Aspen Mansion, just so he and Kendall could laugh at my stupidity every time they walked through the door, and then he turned and vanished back into the world he thought he owned. I waited until the sound of his Porsche had faded into the background noise of the city before I stood up and straightened my spine, feeling the heavy weight of the foundation returning to my soul as I picked up the phone and called Trey to tell him that the target had successfully entered the kill zone. I spent the rest of the night sitting with Leo on the floor of the small living room, watching him play with his blocks, and I whispered into his ear that the world was about to get very loud for the man who tried to make us silent, because a matriarch doesn't need a mansion to reign. She only needs the truth and the patience to wait for the numbers to align. My husband took everything in the divorce until he realized that the everything he took was a $5 million debt that was about to crush him into the dirt, and I was the one who had made sure the ink was dry before the first federal agent knocked on his door. The audit of our marriage was finally over, and the final balance was exactly zero for him and a new life for us. Before we move into the next phase where the federal hammer finally drops and the Aspen mansion becomes a crime scene. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had to play small to win big, because your strength is what builds the world. My husband took everything in the divorce. At least that was the narrative he was busy weaving for the elite social circles of Chicago as he stood in the foyer of our Aspen mansion looking at the hideous red painting he had just secured in a legal battle he thought he won. But in reality, I was the one standing in the shadows of my small South Side apartment, watching the clock tick toward the exact second his empire would begin to liquefy into a pool of federal debt and criminal liability, while the steam from my tea rose in the dim light of a kitchen that smelled of old wood and the fierce, quiet determination of a woman who had finally stopped playing the victim and started playing the auditor. I spent the weekend before the final court hearing meticulously assembling the digital breadcrumbs of Preston's 7 years of financial infidelity, and as a forensic expert, I knew that the beauty of a fraud is always in its complexity, but the beauty of a conviction is always in its simplicity. So I prepared a master file for Trey that mapped every offshore transfer and every forged signature back to Preston's private hardware with a precision that was chilling to witness even for myself, as I realized I was documenting the death of the man I once thought I loved. The day of the final judgment arrived with a heavy gray sky that seemed to press down on the city like a lead weight, and I walked into the Dirksen Federal Building wearing a black vintage suit that felt like armor, my heels clicking against the marble floors with a rhythmic authority that didn't falter, even when I saw Preston standing by the elevators, surrounded by his legal team and the smelling of expensive scotch and unearned victory, as he leaned down to whisper something into the ear of Kendall, who was draped in a silk dress that had been paid for by my son's medical fund. He looked at me with a smirk of absolute triumph and told me that he hoped I enjoyed my new life in the slums, because he was going to turn the Aspen House into a sanctuary of high art and low morals. And I just looked at him with a gaze that was as vacant and cold as a winter lake, and I didn't say a single word because I knew that the loudest sound in that courtroom would be the sound of the gavel hitting the desk. We sat in the high-ceilinged courtroom under the watchful eye of Judge Carter, a woman who had spent 30 years watching men like Preston try to play the system like a violin. And as Mr. Harrison presented the final settlement agreement, I watched Preston's lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, stand up and boast about how his client was magnanimously accepting all corporate liabilities under the As's clause because he was a man of vision who didn't want his ex-wife to be burdened by the complexities of high-level real estate development. Judge Carter leaned forward, her glasses perched on the end of her nose, and she asked me directly if I understood that by signing this I was waiving my right to any future discovery and any claim to the assets of Apex Holdings, and I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Yes, Your Honor, I am more than satisfied with the distribution because I wanted the record to show that I was fully aware of the choice I was making, so that Preston could never claim he was tricked into his own destruction." The moment the judge signed the decree, Preston let out a long, audible sigh of relief and turned to Kendall with a wink, thinking he had just pulled off the greatest heist of his life. But then Mr. Harrison stood up and cleared his throat with a sound that felt like a trap door being unlocked, and he informed the court that there was a final administrative matter regarding the innocent spouse relief application that had been filed with the federal government 3 days prior. Preston's smirk didn't disappear immediately, but it wavered like a candle in a draft, as Mr. Harrison explained that while Preston had assumed all liabilities of the company under the as-is clause, I had been granted an official exemption from the $5 million bridge loan debt because I had provided ironclad evidence that the signatures were forged and that I had been intentionally excluded from the financial management of the household. The color began to drain from Preston's face as the realization hit him that he hadn't just won a house and a company, but he had legally tethered himself to a $5 million default that was currently being investigated as a felony fraud by the IRS. And before he could even turn to his lawyer to ask what was happening, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened and Trey walked in with two other agents in dark suits, their badges gleaming under the courtroom lights. The room went dead silent as Trey walked straight to the defense table and informed Preston Williams that he was under arrest for federal bank fraud, tax evasion, and the forgery of legal documents. And I watched as the man who had called my son a financial shipwreck suddenly looked like a drowning man grasping at straws as the handcuffs were clicked into place over his expensive watch. Kendall let out a sharp gasp and backed away from him as if his misfortune were contagious, and his mother Beatrice, who had been sitting in the front row, let out a scream that was filled with more anger than grief as she realized that the family name she had protected so fiercely was now being dragged through the dirt in front of the very people she sought to impress. Preston looked at me with a face that was purple with rage, and he started to scream that I had set him up, that I was a traitor and a snake. But I just stood there with my hands folded in front of me, and I watched him be led away by the federal agents. And I felt a profound sense of peace, because for 7 years I had carried the weight of his lies, and now the weight was exactly where it belonged. I walked out of the courtroom and into the hallway where the air felt cleaner than it had in a decade, and I saw Trey waiting for me with a small nod of professional respect, because he knew that I had provided the roadmap for the entire operation. And as I stood there, I realized that my husband hadn't taken everything in the divorce. He had merely taken the garbage out for me and left the space clean for a new beginning. I drove back to my small apartment, and I picked up Leo, who had been staying with Savannah, and I held him close to my chest, and I whispered into his ear that the world was finally going to listen to him, because the man who tried to silence us was now the one who was being silenced by the very laws he thought he was above. Before we move into the final part where the hidden trust fund is revealed and the Aspen house is sold at a federal auction, let me know in the comments. If you have ever had to watch someone dig their own grave and resisted the urge to tell them to stop, because sometimes the greatest grace is letting justice take its course. I spent the evening looking at the sunset over the city, and I realized that being a matriarch isn't about the size of your house or the depth of your bank account. It's about the unshakable integrity of your soul and the quiet power of a woman who knows her own worth. And as I looked at the numbers one last time, I saw that the balance was finally in my favor and the audit of my life was complete. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut over Preston's platinum watch was a percussion of justice that echoed in the marrow of my bones, long after the federal agents led him through the heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom and left the room in a state of fractured silence that was only broken by the jagged, hysterical sobbing of Beatrice, who sat in the front row clutching her designer handbag as if it could save her from the sudden poverty of her reputation. I stood there, in the center of the aisle, a woman of 33 who had been treated as the invisible scaffolding of a crumbling empire for 7 years, and I felt the physical weight of his shadow finally lifting off my shoulders, leaving me standing in a light that was cold and blinding and entirely mine to claim as I turned my back on the wreckage of the Williams name and walked out of the building without shedding a single tear, because a forensic auditor knows that moisture is a waste of resources when there are still entries to be made in the ledger of a new life. I drove back to the small apartment on the south side, where the L train provided a rhythmic reminder of the world's indifference to the dramas of the elite, and I sat at my grandmother's table with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, while I opened the hidden leather portfolio I had rescued from the Aspen house weeks ago, a portfolio that contained the only true asset Preston never had the intelligence to look for, because he was too busy counting the gold he thought he had stolen from me. Inside those weathered pages was the documentation for a $2 million medical and educational trust fund established by my grandfather, a man who had spent 40 years laying bricks in the Chicago heat so that his grandchildren would never have to beg for a place to stand. And he had added a specific contingency clause that the trust could only be activated upon the legal dissolution of my marriage to any man who held joint liability for my assets. My grandfather had seen the predator in Preston long before I had been willing to admit it, and he had built a vault around our future that was impenetrable to the greed of a husband who viewed his own son as a financial shipwreck. And as I touched the embossed seal of the trust, I realized that the $60,000 Preston had stolen from the surgery fund was nothing but a drop of water in the ocean of the abundance that was now legally and exclusively available to Leo. Before I tell you about the night Beatrice showed up at my door in the rain, stripped of her silk scarves and her dignity to beg for a loan she would never receive, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever realized that the people who called you the strong one were really just looking for a place to dump their own burdens without having to say thank you? Let me know in the comments where you are listening from, because your strength is a flame that I can feel from here, and it helps me keep going. The next morning, I took the trust documents to the surgical center, and I paid the entire balance for Leo's cochlear implant surgery in full, using a cashier's check that felt as heavy as a mountain in my hand. And I watched the administrator's eyes go wide as she realized that the woman who had been humiliated in the waiting room just days ago was now the one holding the keys to the kingdom. I sat in the preoperative room with Leo holding his small hand as the nurses prepped him for the procedure that would change the trajectory of his life, and I signed the words "for brave and love" over and over again into his palm until his eyes closed under the weight of the anesthesia, leaving me alone in the sterile silence to reflect on the fact that my son's first sound in this new world would not be his father's voice, but the sound of his mother's freedom. While the surgeons were working on Leo, I received a call from Trey, who informed me that the federal prosecutors were moving forward with a dozen counts of wire fraud and money laundering, and that the Aspen house had been officially seized as a forfeit of criminal assets, which meant that Preston's mistress Kendall had been evicted that morning with nothing but the clothes on her back and a suitcase full of fast fashion because the Porsche and the jewelry had already been cataloged as evidence of theft. I felt a sharp, cold sense of satisfaction, not because I was a bitter woman, but because the numbers were finally balancing out, and the interest on the pain Preston had inflicted on us was being collected with a precision that was almost poetic in its finality. The surgery took 5 hours, and when the doctor finally emerged to tell me that the implants were perfectly seated and that Leo's auditory nerve was responsive, I felt the last of the tension leave my body, and I walked into the recovery room to see my son, breathing steadily, a conqueror of silence, who had no idea that his mother had just burned a world to the ground to build him a throne. That night, as I sat in the quiet of the apartment, I heard a frantic, rhythmic tapping on the door, and I opened it to find Beatrice standing in the hallway, her hair a mess, and her eyes red with the desperation of a woman who had realized that her son was not a visionary but a common thief who had spent her retirement savings along with mine. She tried to push her way into the room, claiming that as a mother, I should understand her pain and that I had to help her hire a private defense attorney to save Preston from the 10-year sentence the feds were seeking, but I didn't move an inch to let her in, and I didn't offer her a single word of comfort. I looked at her and I told her that for 7 years I had been the one who fixed the mistakes and hid the shame and carried the weight of her son's arrogance while she watched and praised him for his brilliance. And now the audit was complete and the account was closed. I told her that she should look at the red painting she had so happily helped him steal, because that was the only thing left of the Williams legacy. And then I closed the door and locked it, feeling the sovereign grace of a woman who no longer had to subsidize the destruction of her own soul. The next phase was Activation Day, the day my son would hear the world, and the day I would officially open my own forensic auditing firm to help other women find the gold hidden in the ruins of their marriages. And as I looked at the sunrise over the city, I knew that my husband hadn't taken everything he had just cleared the land, so I could build something that would never fall. I am Nia. I am a mother. I am a matriarch. And I am the auditor of my own destiny. And this was the moment I realized that the true power of a woman is not in how much she can endure, but in how she uses the truth to reclaim her crown. The world thinks I am starting over, but I am actually finishing what I started a decade ago. And this time, the balance sheet is perfect. The recovery period followed a rhythmic cadence of hospital visits and late nights at my grandmother's mahogany table, where the only sound was the scratching of my pen against the legal pads and the distant mournful whistle of the wind whipping off Lake Michigan. And during those 3 weeks of silence before the external processor could be activated, I felt my own senses heightening as if I were preparing my body to be the vessel for all the sound my son was about to receive, and I spent my days moving through the city with a new kind of deliberate grace, a woman who had stripped away the facade of a mansion to find the solid bedrock of her own capability underneath the rubble. I officially registered my new business entity, Williams Forensic Auditing, choosing to keep the name not as a tribute to the man who tried to destroy me, but as a reclamation of the reputation I had built while he was busy playing the role of the visionary, because in the world of high finance, the name Williams was associated with the meticulous accuracy of my work, and I refused to let his criminal stain steal the professional equity I had earned through a decade of excellence. I secured a small suite in the historic Monadnock building, where the thick masonry walls felt like a fortress against the chaos of the world, and I spent my afternoons painting the walls a soft shade of slate gray and hanging my degrees in simple black frames, feeling a profound sense of sovereignty every time I turned the key in the heavy oak door. Trey came over on the second weekend to help me move the last of my professional files, and we sat on the floor of the empty office eating sandwiches while he gave me the latest update on the federal investigation, informing me that the $5 million bridge loan was just the tip of the iceberg and that the feds had uncovered a systematic pattern of money laundering through Preston's real estate developments that spanned 3 states. Because Preston had so arrogantly signed the as-is clause in our divorce, he was now being held personally liable for the restitution of dozens of small contractors and vendors he had stiffed to fund his lifestyle with Kendall and the government was moving to liquidate his remaining personal assets, including the collection of watches and the designer suits he valued more than his own integrity. I listened to the details of his collapse with the clinical detachment of a surgeon observing a distant operation, because the man who was currently sitting in a federal holding cell was a stranger to me, a ghost of a mistake I had finally corrected, and my only concern was the small boy who was currently navigating a world of muffled vibrations and hopeful anticipation. Before I tell you about the morning of the activation, the moment the world finally turned the volume up for my son, and the first word he spoke that broke the last of my emotional dams, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever stood in the wreckage of your old life and realized that the only thing that survived was the only thing you actually needed? Let me know in the comments where you are listening from today, because your stories of survival are the echoes that keep me moving toward the light. The day of the activation arrived with a soft gray drizzle that made the city look like a watercolor painting, and I drove Leo to the clinic, my heart hammering against my ribs, with a rhythm that felt like a countdown to a new era, while he sat in the back seat looking out the window and touching the glass, fascinated by the vibration of the engine. We sat in the small soundproof room with Dr. Aris and a pediatric audiologist who had a voice as soft as velvet, and as they attached the external magnet and the processor to the site behind Leo's ear, I felt a sudden overwhelming wave of grief for the 7 years we had spent in the dark, and then a sudden overwhelming wave of gratitude for the strength that had led us to this chair. Dr. Aris looked at me with a small, encouraging smile and told me that the levels were set and that he was going to activate the signal, and I reached out and took Leo's hand, squeezing it in the secret code we had developed for love and brave. There was a faint electronic click as the software initiated, and for a second, nothing happened, as Leo blinked his eyes wide and confused, looking around the room for a source of the new sensation that was flooding his brain. And then the doctor leaned forward and whispered his name. Leo didn't look at the doctor's hands. He didn't wait for a sign. He turned his head toward the sound with a slow, wonder-filled motion, and his face broke into a smile that was so radiant it felt like the sun had just burst through the hospital ceiling. And he looked at me and said, "Mama," in a voice that was messy and unpracticed and more beautiful than any symphony I had ever heard. I broke in that moment, but it wasn't a breaking of sorrow. It was the breaking of a dam that had been holding back a decade of suppressed emotion. And I pulled my son into my lap, burying my face in his neck, and hearing the small rhythmic gasps of his own laughter as he began to realize that the world was no longer a silent movie. That afternoon we walked out of the clinic and into the rain, and Leo stopped every 5 feet to listen to the squeak of his shoes on the pavement, and the hiss of the tires on the wet asphalt, and the muffled ding of the crosswalk signal, and I realized that my husband hadn't just taken everything in the divorce, he had inadvertently cleared the air so that my son could finally hear the truth of his own existence. When we returned to the apartment, there was a package waiting on the doorstep, a small manila envelope with no return address, and inside was a single photograph of the red painting, the crimson blur which had been cataloged as federal evidence and was now being stored in a climate-controlled warehouse in Virginia. Attached to the photo was a note from the federal prosecutor's office stating that the painting had been appraised at a market value of $45 and that it was being held as part of the criminal forfeiture of Preston Williams' estate. And I laughed a loud, clear sound of absolute victory because I knew that Preston was sitting in his cell thinking about that painting as his golden ticket, while the reality was that it was just another piece of trash he had fought to keep. I sat at my desk that night and I began the first entry in my new professional ledger, recording the activation of my son's hearing as the greatest asset in my portfolio, and the total loss of my husband as the most successful liquidation of my career. And as I looked at the sunrise over the city, I knew that the matriarch's grace was finally mine to wear like a crown. I am 33 years old, and I am the owner of a firm that will never lie and a heart that will never bleed in silence again, because the audit of my life is finally in the black and the future is sounding better every single day. The first Monday morning in my new office at the Monadnock building was a study in sensory reclamation, as the cold Chicago wind rattled the heavy historic windows and the scent of fresh mahogany polish mingled with the aroma of the expensive dark roast coffee I had brewed to celebrate the official opening of Williams Forensic Auditing, while I sat at my restored oak desk, feeling the weight of the key in my pocket, like a sovereign seal of my own independence. And I spent the first few hours meticulously organizing the digital files of my first 3 clients, who were all women of substance and sacrifice, who had been told they were too emotional to understand the math of their own marriages, until I showed them the hidden blood in their husbands' ledgers. My very first client was a woman named Cassandra, who had spent 30 years as a head nurse while her husband built a construction empire on the South Side, only to find out he was planning to retire in Florida with a younger woman and a secret offshore account. And as I walked her through the forensic mapping of her own life, I saw the exact moment the light of realization hit her eyes, and I knew that my work was no longer about corporate compliance, but about the restoration of justice for the matriarchs who had been treated as invisible foundations. Leo was in school now, flourishing in a specialized program where he could hear the laughter of his peers and the voice of his teacher for the first time. And every afternoon when I picked him up, he would tell me a new sound he had discovered, like the hiss of a bus or the barking of a distant dog, and those sounds were the only interest I cared to collect on the years I had lost to Preston's arrogance. The legal drama surrounding Apex Holdings was continuing to spiral into a black hole of federal litigation, and Trey informed me that the bank had officially filed a foreclosure notice on the Aspen mansion because the bridge loan was in absolute default, and since Preston had legally assumed all liabilities under the A's clause, he was now being sued by the very financial institutions he had tried to charm with his forged signatures. I received a frantic letter from Preston's new court-appointed attorney, a man who sounded exhausted and overwhelmed by the sheer volume of his client's financial crimes, and he was begging me to consider a post-divorce mediation to restructure the debt, because Preston was facing a sentencing recommendation of 15 years in federal prison if he couldn't show a good faith effort toward restitution. I read the letter twice while sitting in the quiet of my office, and I felt a profound sense of emptiness where my anger used to be, because I realized that Preston was still trying to use me as a safety net, even from behind bars, thinking that my grace was a renewable resource he could harvest whenever he ran out of options. I didn't respond to the letter. Instead, I forwarded it to Mr. Harrison with a single instruction to remind the defense that the contract was closed and the audit was final, because I was no longer in the business of saving a man who had intentionally tried to drown my son's future in a sea of debt. Beatrice showed up at my office later that afternoon, her face pale and her designer coat looking out of place in the hard-working hallways of the Monadnock, and she stood in my doorway with a look of desperate entitlement as she asked me how I could be so heartless as to watch her son rot in a cell while I sat in luxury. I stood up and looked at her with the cold eyes of a woman who had already processed the cost of her own survival, and I told her that this office was not a gift from her son, but a fortress I had built with the bricks he had tried to throw at me, and that if she wanted to talk about heartlessness, she should look at the bank statements from the medical fund he had emptied. I told her that she was welcome to stay and wait for her son's release in 15 years, but that my time was no longer available for her exploitation. And then I walked her to the door and watched her vanish into the elevator, feeling the final thread of the Williams legacy snap in my hands. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following Friday, and I decided to attend not out of malice, but as a witness to the final balancing of the scales. And I walked into the courtroom wearing a tailored navy suit that felt like armor, my heart steady and my mind clear as I took a seat in the back row, far away from the cameras and the gossip mongers. Preston was led in wearing a drab orange jumpsuit, his hair graying and his posture slumped, and when he saw me for a brief second, I saw a flash of the old manipulative charm in his eyes, as if he expected me to stand up and testify in his defense. But I remained as still and silent as a stone as the judge read the list of his crimes. The judge specifically mentioned the as-is clause in the divorce decree, calling it a textbook example of a man's pride becoming his own undoing, and she noted that Preston's attempt to defraud the mother of his child was a factor in the severity of the sentence, which she set at 12 years without the possibility of early parole. As they led him away, he screamed my name, telling me that he would get out and take everything back, but I just looked at him and thought about the red painting in the warehouse, and I realized that he still didn't understand that the only thing he had left was a lie. I walked out of the courtroom and into the bright Chicago sunshine, feeling the warmth of the spring air on my face, and I drove to the park to meet Leo and Savannah for a picnic, where we sat on a blanket and listened to the sounds of the city breathing around us. Leo ran through the grass, listening to the crunch of the dried leaves, and he looked back at me and shouted, "Mama, look!" And in that moment, I knew that the matriarch's grace was not about how much we could carry, but about how we chose to set it down. I spent the evening drafting a new proposal for a community auditing clinic where I could help women in the South Side protect their assets and their children from the predators in their own homes. Because I knew that my story was not just about my own victory, but about the collective rise of the women who have been the unbreakable foundation for far too long. The world thinks I am a woman who was lucky to escape a bad man, but the truth is that I am a woman who used her intellect to reclaim her life, and the numbers on my balance sheet are finally in perfect alignment. I am Nia, and my son can hear me when I tell him that he is the most valuable asset I will ever own. And as I looked at the moon rising over the lake, I knew that the audit of my soul was finally complete, and the future was sounding more beautiful every single day. The $5 million debt was no longer a shadow, but a footnote in a history that I had rewritten with my own hands. And as I closed my eyes, I felt the deep, feminine, soulful peace of a woman who had finally stopped holding the line and started reigning in her own kingdom. I realized that my husband hadn't taken everything in the divorce. He had just cleared the land so I could build a dynasty that would never fall, and the silent grace of my new life was the loudest victory of all. The golden light of a Chicago autumn filtered through the silent grace of my new life was the loudest victory of all. The golden light of a Chicago autumn filtered through the tall, narrow windows of my office in the Monadnock building, casting long architectural shadows across the oak floorboards that felt like the steady hand of history guiding my own. And as I sat at my desk reviewing the digital footprint of a local politician who was trying to hide a second family and a third mortgage, I realized that my life had become a masterclass in the art of the invisible pivot. Because while the world saw a woman who had been stripped of her mansion and her status, I saw a woman who had finally cleared the clutter of a fraudulent marriage to make room for a sovereign truth that didn't require a 5-car garage to sustain its dignity. My firm was no longer just a startup, but a destination for the women of the Gold Coast and the South Side alike, who had begun to whisper my name in the corners of their country clubs and church pews as the woman who could find the money that their husbands swore didn't exist. And every time I uncovered a hidden offshore account or a forged deed, I felt a quiet ripple of justice for the younger version of myself, who had been too afraid to look at her own mailbox. Leo was thriving in his second month of school, his speech becoming more crisp and confident with every passing week, and he had developed a fascination with the sound of the wind in the trees outside our new apartment in Bronzeville, a sound that he called the world's breath, and listening to him describe it made me realize that the 7 years of silence we had endured together were not a waste, but a period of deep root strengthening that was now producing the most vibrant fruit of my life. I received a phone call from Trey on a Tuesday afternoon while I was mid-audit on a complex real estate trust, and his voice held that specific professional gravity that usually preceded a significant update in the federal liquidation process of the Williams estate, informing me that the Aspen Mansion had officially been sold at a court-ordered auction to a group of international investors for a fraction of its former appraised value. Because the $5 million bridge loan remained the primary lien on the property, and Preston had legally assumed all liability under the as-is clause, the proceeds of the sale were immediately seized by the bank, leaving a deficit of nearly $3 million that would remain on Preston's record as a non-dischargeable debt for the rest of his natural life. Trey mentioned that the federal marshals had completed their sweep of the property and had found a hidden safe in the master bedroom closet that Preston had forgotten about in his haste to move Kendall in, and inside they had found a collection of high-end watches and loose diamonds that were now being cataloged as part of the criminal restitution fund for the vendors he had defrauded. It was a cold, poetic symmetry to realize that the very objects he had used to build his facade of success were now the tools being used to dismantle his legacy, and I felt a profound sense of closure as I checked the final box on the mental ledger I had been keeping since that day at the pediatric clinic. Before I tell you about the desperate handwritten letter that arrived from the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, where Preston was currently serving his first year of 12, and the chilling proposal he tried to make regarding our son's future, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever realized that the person who tried to break you was actually just projecting their own fragility onto your strength because they knew they couldn't survive the weight of their own lies? Let me know in the comments where you are watching from today, because your presence in this story is a testament to the power of a woman who refuses to be erased. I spent the evening at home with Leo and Savannah, sitting in the warmth of my kitchen while the smell of roasting chicken and rosemary filled the air, and we talked about the future, not as a series of obstacles to be overcome, but as a landscape to be explored with the quiet confidence of people who had already survived the storm. Savannah told me that Beatrice had been seen working as a part-time hostess at a restaurant in the suburbs, her designer wardrobe replaced by a polyester uniform, and her once proud posture slumped under the weight of a reality she could no longer manipulate into a fairy tale of social prominence. I didn't feel a flicker of joy at her misfortune, because as a forensic auditor, I knew that every unpaid debt eventually finds its collector, and Beatrice was simply paying the interest on 30 years of enabling her son's narcissism at the expense of everyone else's peace. The letter from Preston arrived on Thursday morning, tucked inside a legal envelope from his attorney, and as I opened it, I felt the faint metallic scent of a prison cell clinging to the paper, a stark contrast to the expensive cologne that used to define his presence. He wrote with a frantic, jagged script that spoke of a man who was finally beginning to understand that his charm held no currency, with a federal judge begging me to visit him and bring Leo so that he could explain his side of the story, and promising that if I helped him secure an early release, he would sign over the rights to a secret offshore account he had allegedly hidden from the IRS. I read the letter twice my face, a mask of cold, analytical detachment, before I dropped it into the shredder and watched the teeth of the machine turn his last manipulation into meaningless ribbons of white paper, because I knew there was no secret account, and even if there were, I wouldn't touch a single cent of money that was stained with the blood of his dishonesty. I was 33 years old, a matriarch in the making, and a woman who had finally learned that grace is not a limited resource to be bartered for the comfort of a predator, but a sovereign state of being that is protected by the walls of the truth. My son was safe, my business was thriving, and the $5 million debt that Preston had tried to sink me with was now the anchor that kept him firmly rooted in the reality of his own making, while I sailed into a future that was no longer a shipwreck, but a cinematic epic of my own design. I spent the rest of the afternoon drafting a new curriculum for a financial literacy program for young mothers in the city because I wanted to ensure that no other woman ever had to stand at a reception desk and hear the word declined while her child's future hung in the balance. And as the sun set over the lake, I felt the deep, soul-stirring peace of a woman who had finally stopped holding the line and started reigning in her own light. The audit was complete, the books were closed, and the balance was finally and gloriously in the black, because I had realized that my husband hadn't taken everything in the divorce. He had just cleared the land so I could build a temple that would never fall, and the silent grace of my new life was the loudest victory I would ever achieve. I am Nia, and I am the owner of my own name, and as I looked at my reflection in the window, I didn't see an unbreakable foundation. I saw a woman who was perfectly and beautifully whole. The first frost of the Chicago winter arrived like a silent auditor, creeping across the city rooftops and silvering the iron railings of the Monadnock building, while I sat in my office, surrounded by the steady hum of my own success and the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock that stood in the corner like a sentinel of the time I had finally reclaimed for myself. I watched the steam curl from my morning tea and thought about how different this winter felt compared to the last 7 years, when every cold snap was accompanied by the biting chill of Preston's growing indifference and the mounting pressure of maintaining a facade that was beginning to crack under the weight of his hidden debts and his hollow promises. My office had become a sanctuary of truth, a place where the wood was polished and the files were organized with a precision that bordered on the sacred, because I knew that for every woman who sat across from me, the data I uncovered was the only weapon she had against the men who had treated her loyalty as a bottomless credit line. I was currently working on a case for a woman named Regina, who had spent 40 years building a catering empire in the city only to find that her husband had been using the business accounts to fund a secret life in another state. And as I traced the flow of her hard-earned capital through a series of shell companies, I felt a familiar cold fire burning in my chest, a fire that wasn't fueled by anger, but by the sober necessity of restitution. Leo had started taking piano lessons because his new ears were so hungry for melody, and the sound of him practicing in our Bronzeville home in the evenings was the most beautiful music I had ever known because it was the sound of a child who was no longer a shipwreck, but a captain of his own sensory world. I had recently hired an assistant, a young woman named Maya, who reminded me of who I used to be before the world tried to tell me that my value was tied to the man on my arm. And I spent my mornings mentoring her in the art of the forensic deep dive, showing her how to look past the numbers to find the human stories of betrayal and resilience hidden in the margins of a tax return. Trey called me on a Friday afternoon, his voice sounding crisp and energized, as he informed me that the federal government had officially closed the books on the primary liquidation of Apex Holdings, and that the total amount of criminal restitution owed by Preston had been finalized at a staggering $6.8 million, which included the unpaid taxes, the defaulted bridge loan, and the defrauded vendors. Because Preston had so arrogantly signed that as-is clause, he was now being hit with a lifetime of wage garnishments and asset seizures that would ensure he never owned anything more valuable than a plastic spoon for the duration of his natural life. And Trey mentioned that the IRS had officially moved to seize the remaining jewelry and luxury items that Kendall had tried to hide in a storage unit in her mother's name. It was a total and absolute erasure of the life he had tried to build at my expense, and I felt a profound sense of lightness as I realized that I didn't have to carry the weight of his failure anymore, because the law was finally doing the heavy lifting that I had been doing manually for a decade. Before I tell you about the cold encounter I had with one of our former country club friends at a charity gala in the Gold Coast, and the way I used my quiet grace to dismantle her passive-aggressive pity, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever realized that the people who were the loudest in your life during your success were the first ones to disappear when you finally decided to stand in your own truth? Let me know in the comments where you are watching from today, because your presence in this community is a testimony to the fact that we are never truly alone in our rising. I decided to attend the gala for the Chicago Children's Foundation, not to seek the spotlight, but to represent my firm and to show the city that Nia Williams was not a footnote in a scandal, but the headline of a new era. I wore a gown of deep emerald silk that moved like water around my feet, and I kept my hair in a natural, elegant updo that felt like a crown of my own making. And as I walked into the ballroom, I felt the eyes of the city's elite turning toward me with a mixture of curiosity and a dawning respect that was no longer tied to my husband's name. I was standing near the terrace when a woman named Eleanor, who had once been my closest confidant in the Aspen social circle, approached me with a glass of champagne and a look of practiced concern that didn't reach her eyes. She started to offer me her sympathies for the unfortunate situation with Preston and asked how I was managing in such a modest neighborhood, suggesting that if I needed a recommendation for a good domestic agency, she might be able to find someone to help me with the child. I didn't flinch and I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I took a slow sip of my water and looked at her with the calm, unshakable gaze of a woman who knew exactly what her house was worth and what her heart was made of. I told her that I had never been happier and that my neighborhood was filled with the kind of history and soul that a gated community could never replicate. And then I mentioned that I had recently seen a familiar name in a series of construction liens I was auditing for a client. I watched the color drain from her face as she realized that her own husband's company was currently under my professional microscope. And I told her that if she ever wanted a forensic review of her own marital assets, she knew where to find me, because a matriarch's grace is not about being nice, it is about being clear. She excused herself within seconds, and as I watched her retreat back into the crowd, I realized that the power I held now was not based on the appearance of wealth, but on the unshakable reality of my own competence. I returned home that night and sat on the edge of Leo's bed, watching him sleep, and I realized that the $5 million debt Preston had tried to bury me with had actually been the most important investment I ever made, because it bought me the freedom to see the world as it truly was. I am 33 years old, and I am the owner of a firm that helps women find their voices, and a mother to a son who can hear the heartbeat of the world, and the balance sheet of my life is finally and gloriously in the black. I spent the next few hours drafting a new expansion plan for my firm because I wanted to reach more women in the surrounding suburbs who were being gaslit into financial poverty by the very men they were supporting. And as the moon rose over the skyline, I felt the deep, feminine, soulful peace of a woman who had finally stopped holding the line and started reigning in her own power. The audit was complete, the books were closed, and the future was sounding more beautiful every single day, because I had finally learned that the only person who can truly grant you grace is yourself. I am Naya, and I am sovereign, and as I closed my eyes, I knew that the story of the matriarch's grace was only just beginning, and that the chapters to come would be written in the ink of my own unshakable truth. The $5 million debt was gone, the prison cell was occupied, and the light was finally mine. My husband took everything in the divorce. At least that was the story he was telling his cellmates in the cold, damp corridors of the Federal Correctional Facility, while I was busy standing in the warm light of my own kitchen in Bronzeville, seasoning a cast-iron skillet with the same patient care I had used to rebuild my entire existence from the subatomic level up. And as the scent of burning oil and hope filled the room, I realized that the greatest asset I had ever possessed wasn't the $5 million or the Aspen estate, but the quiet, unshakable capacity to wait for the truth to catch up with the lies. It had been 18 months since the day at the pediatric clinic, and my office in the Monadnock building was no longer just a suite of rooms, but a lighthouse for the women of Chicago who were tired of being the silent partners in their own dispossession. And as I sat at my desk that afternoon looking at the bank records of a high-profile senator's wife, I realized that the pattern was always the same, because men like Preston don't change their playbooks, they just change their targets. This woman sat across from me, her eyes rimmed with the same red exhaustion I remembered seeing in my own reflection, and she told me that her husband had convinced her that their family foundation was empty, while he was actually funneling millions into a private equity firm registered in his mistress's maiden name. And as I reached out to take her hand, I felt the electric spark of a sisterhood that is born in the trenches of betrayal. Before I tell you about the final desperate phone call I received from Preston's lawyer as his appeal was denied for the third and final time, let me know in the comments if you have ever had to be the one to tell the truth in a room full of people who were paid to lie to you, because your voice is the only thing that can break the silence of an era. I spent the evening preparing for Leo's first real piano recital, a night that was meant to be the coronation of his new auditory life. And as I watched him practice his scales, I thought about the way Preston used to call him a financial shipwreck and a burden, and I felt a cold, sharp pride in knowing that the man who had discarded us was now the only one truly lost in the dark. We arrived at the conservatory, and the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the nervous energy of children. And as Leo walked onto the stage in his small navy blazer and adjusted the bench, I felt the entire room hold its breath along with me as he looked toward the back of the hall where I was sitting, and I gave him the secret sign for brave. He began to play a piece by Chopin, and the notes were clear and crystalline, floating through the air with a purity that made my eyes sting, because I knew that he was hearing every vibration and every nuance of the melody he was creating with his own hands. And at that moment, I realized that the $2 million trust fund my grandfather had left wasn't just money. It was the sound of a legacy that Preston could never touch. Trey and Savannah were sitting next to me, their hands clasped in mine, and as the final chord echoed through the hall, the audience erupted into applause. And Leo stood up and bowed with a dignity that was so far beyond his years, it made the world feel small. The next morning, I received a call from Mr. Harrison informing me that the last of the Williams family assets had been liquidated and that Beatrice had been officially evicted from her suburban apartment because she had tried to use a forged power of attorney to access a line of credit she didn't own. And I felt a profound sense of closure as I realized that the cycle of fraud was finally over. I walked into my office and found a letter from the warden's office at Terre Haute stating that Preston had been placed in protective custody after a physical altercation over a debt he couldn't pay inside the walls. And I realized that even in prison he was still trying to live beyond his means. I spent the afternoon drafting a new partnership agreement for my firm because I wanted to bring on 2 other forensic accountants who were also survivors of financial abuse, because I knew that the only way to truly protect the matriarchs was to build a fortress of professional integrity that was as unbreakable as they were. My husband took everything in the divorce until he realized that the everything he took was a lifetime of debt and a legacy of shame. And as I looked at the sunset over the lake, I knew that the balance sheet of my life was finally and gloriously in the black. I am 33 years old, and I am a woman who has learned that grace is not a commodity to be traded, but a sovereign state of being that is earned through the fire and the light of the truth. And as I closed my eyes, I felt the deep, feminine, soulful peace of a woman who had finally stopped holding the line and started reigning in her own power. The audit was complete. The books were closed, and the future was sounding more beautiful every single day, because I had finally learned that the only person who can truly grant you grace is yourself, and I was finally and forever free. The second winter of my independence arrived not with a whisper, but with a howling wind that rattled the historic frames of the Monadnock building, as if the city itself were trying to audit the strength of my resolve. And as I sat in my office surrounded by the scent of expensive ink and the quiet, unshakable power of a woman who had finally learned to value her own silence, I realized that the $5 million debt Preston had tried to drown me with had become the very air that allowed me to breathe, because in the world of forensic accounting, every negative has a corresponding positive if you have the patience to wait for the ledger to balance. I spent that morning reviewing the final liquidation reports of Apex Holdings, which had become a case study in corporate vanity. And as I looked at the line items showing the seizure of the Aspen House and the auctioning of Preston's watch collection, I felt a profound sense of mathematical justice that was cleaner than any revenge I could have scripted with my own hands. My firm was now the premier destination for the silent pillars of Chicago's elite, the women who had spent decades holding up houses built on the shifting sands of their husbands' egos. And as I sat across from my newest client, a woman named Eleanor, whose husband had been hiding millions in a maze of laundromats and shell companies, I felt the familiar weight of the matriarch's grace settling over my shoulders like a mantle of gold. I watched Eleanor's hands tremble as she looked at the evidence of her husband's betrayal, and I realized that my voice was no longer just a tool for professional advancement, but a vessel for the restoration of sovereign worth for every woman who had been told she was a liability while she was actually the only true asset in the room. Leo was flourishing in his third year of sound, his speech now so fluid and vibrant that the silence of the past felt like a distant dream, and every time he whispered a secret into my ear or laughed at the sound of the rain, I was reminded that the $60,000 Preston had stolen was the worst investment he ever made and the best debt I ever collected. I received a final communique from Trey regarding the criminal restitution proceedings, and he informed me that the federal government had officially denied Preston's last appeal because the as-is clause he had signed in his narcissistic haste was considered a legally binding assumption of risk that no court in the land was willing to overturn. Preston was now serving the second year of his 12-year sentence in a facility where the only real estate he developed was the 6x9 space between his bunk and the bars. And I heard through the legal grapevine that Kendall had been spotted working at a high-end car dealership in a different state her Porsche repossessed, and her dreams of being a mogul's wife reduced to a commission-based existence on the showroom floor. Beatrice had sent me a handwritten letter through a chaplain asking for my forgiveness and claiming that she had finally realized the error of her son's ways. But as I looked at the elegant loops of her script, I realized that her apology was just another unrecorded liability, another attempt to trade on a relationship that she had defaulted on years ago. So I placed the letter in the shredder and watched the teeth of the machine turn her desperation into confetti. I spent the evening at home in Bronzeville, sitting on the porch with Savannah, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, and we talked about the generations of women who had carried the weight of the world without ever asking for a seat at the table, and I realized that my success was not an anomaly, but a debt paid to my ancestors, who had worked in the shadows so that I could reign in the light. My husband had taken everything in the divorce, at least that was the lie he told himself to survive the night. But the truth was that he had only taken the noise, the lies, the debt, and the worthless red painting that was now gathering dust in a federal evidence locker, while I had taken the only things that could never be appraised: my son's voice, my own integrity, and a future that was finally and gloriously in the black. I was 33 years old, a master forensic auditor, a mother and a queen of my own sovereign territory. And as I looked at my reflection in the glass, I didn't see a woman who had been broken by a predator, but a woman who had used the math of her own pain to build a fortress that would never fall. I spent the final hours of the night drafting a scholarship fund for children with hearing loss in the city because I wanted to ensure that no other mother ever had to choose between her dignity and her child's ability to hear the world. And as I signed the first check, I felt the deep, feminine, soulful peace of a woman who had finally stopped holding the line and started building the world. The audit was complete, the books were closed, and the silence of my new life was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, because it was the sound of a woman who finally knew her own worth and refused to let a single cent of it be stolen ever again. I am Nia, and I am free. And as the moon rose over the Lake Michigan shoreline, I knew that the matriarch's grace was the only legacy I would ever need to leave behind, because the truth always balances out in the end. My husband took everything in the divorce. At least that was the story he was telling the ghosts of his former glory in a cold concrete cell while I was busy standing in the center of my expanded offices on the top floor of the Monadnock building, watching the sunrise bleed across the Chicago skyline like a celestial audit of the day to come. And as I felt the vibration of the city beneath my feet, I realized that the $5 million debt Preston had tried to anchor to my soul was now the very fuel that powered my ascent into a realm of financial sovereignty he could never have imagined in his wildest narcissistic fantasies. It had been 2 years since the gavel fell, and the world of Nia Williams had been redefined from a silent partner in a fraudulent empire to the most feared forensic auditor in the Midwest, a woman who didn't just look at numbers, but look through them to see the blood and the bone of the secrets men tried to bury in the margins of their luxury lifestyles. I sat at my desk, which was now a custom piece of black walnut and steel, and I opened the file of my newest high-profile case, a woman named Gabrielle, whose husband was a tech mogul currently trying to convince a judge that his $30 million exit from his startup was somehow exempt from marital property while he was actually hiding the liquidity in a series of smart contracts on the blockchain. I reached out and touched the gold monogram on my leather portfolio, feeling the cool, unyielding reality of my own name, and I knew that Gabrielle wasn't just paying for my expertise. She was paying for the version of me that had already walked through the fire and come out with the deed to the furnace. Before I tell you about the shocking letter I received from the federal appellate court regarding the final disposition of the Aspen property and the way Preston's own mother tried to sue me for a portion of the trust fund, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever realized that the people who called you selfish for setting boundaries were actually just mad that they could no longer use you as a staircase to their own unearned success? Let me know in the comments where you are watching from today, because every time I read your words, I feel the collective heartbeat of a sisterhood that is no longer willing to be the invisible foundation of a lie. The Chicago morning was crisp and sharp, the kind of weather that forces you to be honest with yourself. And as I walked Leo to his new private academy, where he was now the lead soloist in the youth choir, I felt a surge of maternal triumph that was more intoxicating than any professional victory, because every note he sang was a direct rebuttal to his father's claim that he was a financial shipwreck. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment, listening to the hiss of the morning bus and the rhythmic tapping of heels on the pavement, and Leo looked up at me with those bright hearing eyes and said, "Mom, do you think the wind has a color?" And I had to stop and catch my breath, because for 7 years I would have given my life just to hear him ask a question about the world's beauty. I returned to my office to find Trey waiting for me with a stack of federal documents and a look of grim satisfaction that I knew meant the final dominoes of the Williams estate were beginning to tumble into the abyss. Trey informed me that the appellate court had not only denied Preston's request for a stay of the restitution order, but had also authorized the seizure of a secret collection of vintage sports cards he had been hiding in his mother's basement, a collection that was valued at nearly $400,000 and would now be used to pay off the interest on the bridge loan he had forged my name on, because Preston had signed the as-is clause with such desperate hubris. He was now legally responsible for the storage fees and the legal costs of his own forfeiture, and the irony of him paying to be dismantled was a flavor of justice that I savored with the cold precision of a fine wine. I spent the afternoon drafting a new scholarship program through Grace Forensic Services for young women in accounting, because I wanted to ensure that the next generation of Black women wouldn't just be the ones doing the work, but the ones owning the firms and the buildings they worked in. Later that evening, there was a knock at my office door, and I looked at the monitor to see Beatrice standing in the hallway, her once impeccable designer suit now frayed at the cuffs, and her face wearing the jagged mask of a woman who had finally run out of credit with the universe. I pressed the button to let her in, and she walked into the room with a sudden frantic energy, claiming that I was a monster, for allowing her son to sit in a cell while I lived in luxury, and demanding that I release a portion of Leo's trust to pay for a new high-powered legal team, because she believed that a different lawyer could somehow undo the math of a federal fraud. I stood up and looked at her with the cold, unshakable grace of a woman who had already processed her grief, and I told her that she was welcome to file a lawsuit if she felt so inclined, but that she should be aware that my firm would be the one conducting the counter-audit of her own financial history during the years she accepted gifts from Preston's fraudulent accounts. I watched the color drain from her face as she realized that I wasn't just a mother protecting her cub, but an auditor protecting a sovereign state, and that I had the receipts for every silk scarf and every spa day she had ever enjoyed at the expense of our son's medical fund. I told her that the foundation was no longer accepting new residents and that her son's debt was a legacy she would have to carry on her own back, just as I had carried the weight of his arrogance for a decade. And then I watched her walk out of my life for the final time, feeling the absolute silence of a closing door. My husband had taken everything in the divorce. At least that was the story the bank told the world, but he had actually taken the trash out for me, leaving the space clean for a matriarch who knew that the only thing more powerful than a lie was a ledger that never forgets. I am Nia, and I am the master of my own numbers, and as I looked at the sunset over the lake, I knew that the audit of my soul was finally and gloriously in the black, and the future was sounding more beautiful every single day. The $5 million debt was his, the trust was mine, and the silence of my victory was the loudest sound I had ever heard, because I finally realized that grace is not about forgiveness. It is about the unyielding clarity of the truth. My husband took everything in the divorce. At least that was the delusion he was currently feeding the other inmates in the federal facility, while I sat in the hushed elegance of my Bronzeville library, surrounded by the scent of old leather books and the sweet lingering fragrance of the jasmine tea that had become my evening ritual. And as I looked at the glowing screen of my tablet, I realized that the $5 million debt Preston had tried to bury me with was now a landmark case study in the forensic accounting world, a permanent scar on his name, and a shining badge of my own unshakable survival. It had been nearly 30 months since the day at the pediatric clinic, and the transformation of Nia Williams from a discarded wife to a titan of financial justice was complete, because I had spent every waking hour since then ensuring that no other woman in this city would ever have to stand in a sterile waiting room and hear the word declined because her husband decided her child was a bad investment. My firm, Grace Forensic Services, was now handling the most complex asset recovery cases in the country. And as I scrolled through the data on my latest investigation involving a private equity mogul who had tried to hide his liquidity in a network of luxury properties in Dubai, I felt a cold, sharp surge of intellectual power because I knew that his sophisticated layering of funds was no match for a woman who had already dismantled a $5 million lie with nothing but a ledger and a sense of grace. Leo walked into the room, his steps confident and sure as he navigated the world of sound with a grace that made my heart swell, and he climbed onto the sofa next to me, leaning his head against my shoulder as he listened to the soft, rhythmic clicking of my keyboard, which he now called the sound of Mama's work. He looked at me and asked if the clouds made noise when they moved across the moon, and I had to close my eyes for a moment to catch my breath, because the sheer poetic wonder of his mind was the greatest dividend I had ever collected on the years of silence we had endured together. I received a notification from my legal team that a final motion had been filed by Preston's defense regarding the $5 million bridge loan, claiming that there had been a procedural error in the way the innocent spouse relief was granted. But as I reviewed the motion, I saw only the desperate scratching of a man who was finally realizing that his cage was permanent and his debt was eternal. I knew that Trey and the federal agents had already secured the hardware from the crypto exchange, and that the digital trail leading back to Preston's private logins was ironclad, leaving no room for a legal miracle or a technicality to save him from the consequences of his own hubris. I spent the next few hours drafting a rebuttal that was so precise and so devastating in its clarity that I knew the judge would dismiss the motion before the ink was even dry, because a forensic auditor doesn't just present evidence, she presents the absolute and undeniable truth of a transaction. Before I tell you about the shocking phone call I received from Kendall, who was calling from a burner phone in a different state to offer me information in exchange for a witness protection recommendation, let me know in the comments where you are watching from today, because your presence in this journey is the proof that we can all find our voices in the midst of the quietest betrayals. I sat in the library watching the city lights twinkle through the windows, and I realized that my husband hadn't taken anything in the divorce. He had only taken the noise and the lies and the weight of a man who never deserved the privilege of my presence. My grandfather's trust was now fully integrated into Leo's future, providing a security that was as deep as the Chicago bedrock. And as I looked at my son's sleeping face, I knew that the matriarch's grace was not a shield I wore, but a kingdom I had built with my own hands. I was 33 years old, a master of my craft, a mother to a miracle, and a woman who finally knew that the only balance sheet that mattered was the one written in the ink of her own unshakable worth. The night was quiet, and the world was sounding more beautiful every single day, because I had finally stopped holding the line for a ghost and started reigning in the light of my own sovereign power. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent being the invisible support for a man who didn't even know the color of my soul, and I felt a profound sense of liberation as I realized that the audit of my life was finally and gloriously in the black, leaving no room for the ghosts of the past to haunt the halls of my new beginning. The $5 million debt was his, the trust was mine, and the silence of my victory was the loudest and most cinematic sound I had ever heard, because I finally realized that the truth is the only currency that never devalues. My husband took everything in the divorce until he realized I owned his $5 million debt, and as I sat in the hushed, amber-lit sanctuary of my office, the phone in my hand felt like a cold, vibrating piece of lead, because the caller ID was a scrambled, untraceable number that signaled the arrival of a final, desperate ghost from the life I had so meticulously liquidated. I pressed the phone to my ear, my breath steady and my heart a rhythmic, unshakable drum in the quiet room, and I heard the sound of jagged, shallow breathing on the other end. The sound of a woman who had finally run out of paved road. It was Kendall, her voice stripped of the youthful arrogance and the high-pitched giggles that had once echoed through the hallways of my stolen mansion, and now she sounded like a brittle piece of glass being ground into the dirt of a roadside motel. She told me she was terrified, that Preston had people on the outside who were looking for the rest of the crypto keys, and that she had been living on the run since the feds seized the Porsche and the jewelry, realizing too late that being a mistress to a narcissist is just a long-term lease on a property that's already in foreclosure. She offered me a deal. She had the password to a secondary cold storage wallet that Preston had hidden in a safe deposit box under her maiden name, a wallet that contained another $3 million in untraceable assets, and she was willing to give it all to me if I would help her secure a deal with Trey for witness immunity. I sat there in the silence of the Monadnock building, listening to her beg for the very grace she had helped Preston strip from my life, and I felt a profound, cold sense of irony because she was asking a forensic auditor to help her hide the very trail I had spent a decade learning to expose. I didn't feel anger toward her, nor did I feel the urge to rescue her, because I knew that in the world of financial liability, there was no such thing as a free lunch, and Kendall was simply the latest invoice being presented for payment in a transaction she never understood. I told her, my voice as calm and flat as a winter horizon, that I didn't deal in back-alley immunity, and that my firm only audited the truth, not the lies people told to save their own skins. I informed her that if she wanted to survive, she should walk into the nearest federal building and hand over the keys without a bargain, because as long as she held on to that stolen money, she wasn't an investor. She was a target. I hung up the phone and felt the sovereign peace of a woman who no longer had to balance the moral deficits of people who didn't deserve her energy. And I turned my gaze back to the window where the Chicago skyline was a glittering map of the world I had conquered with my own intellect. Before I tell you about the final legal maneuver I executed to ensure that even if Preston ever breathed a free breath again, he would be a financial ghost in his own country. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had to watch your enemies destroy themselves while you simply stood in the light of your own truth, because your silence is the loudest weapon you possess. I spent the next morning in a high-level briefing with Trey and the federal prosecution team, handing over the digital recording of Kendall's call and the location of the cold storage wallet, because I wanted the audit of the Williams estate to be so complete that not a single cent of fraudulent capital remained in circulation. Trey told me that the feds were moving to arrest Kendall by nightfall, and that the discovery of the hidden $3 million would likely add another 5 years to Preston's sentence for failure to disclose assets during the bankruptcy proceedings. Because Preston had signed the as-is clause and the waiver of discovery, he had legally barred himself from ever claiming that these hidden funds were marital property, meaning the entire $3 million would go straight into the federal restitution fund to pay back the vendors and the builders he had cheated. I sat in the conference room surrounded by men in dark suits who now looked at me with a reverence that bordered on fear, and I realized that I had become the very thing Preston always feared, a woman who knew her own numbers and wasn't afraid to use them to rebuild the world. Leo was waiting for me at home, his piano music filling the hallway of our Bronzeville brownstone with a melody that felt like a bridge between the silence of the past and the roar of the future. And as he saw me, he jumped up and hugged me, telling me that his teacher said he had a perfect ear for the colors of the sound. I held him close, my eyes stinging with the beauty of a life that was no longer a shipwreck, but a sovereign kingdom, and I whispered a promise to him that he would never have to be a pawn in anyone's game, because his mother had already cleared the board. I spent the evening drafting a new expansion plan for my firm, looking to open offices in Atlanta and Houston, because the matriarchs of the South were also being treated like foundations for men who forgot that the ground can move, and I wanted to be the earthquake that brought them to their knees. My husband had taken everything in the divorce until he realized that the everything was a liability, and that I was the one who held the deed to the only real power in the room, the truth. I was 33 years old, a master forensic auditor, a mother to a miracle, and a woman who finally knew that the matriarch's grace is not a gift you give to others, but a throne you build for yourself. The $5 million debt was a footnote. The prison cell was a certainty, and the light of my new life was a cinematic masterpiece that was only just beginning its final act. I realized then that when you stop holding the rope for people who are determined to fall, you find that your hands are finally free to reach for the stars, and the silence of my victory was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I looked at the sunrise over the lake and knew that the books were closed. The balance was perfect, and Nia Williams was finally gloriously and forever in the black. My husband took everything in the divorce until he realized I owned his $5 million debt. And as I stood on the 40th floor of the Monadnock building, watching the first winter snow begin to lace the Chicago skyline in a cold crystalline shroud, I realized that the numbers on a balance sheet are the only truth that never flinches in the dark. And as a 33-year-old woman who had spent a decade being the invisible foundation of a man's vanity, I was finally the one holding the gavel of my own destiny. The office around me was a sanctuary of high ceilings and dark walnut paneling, smelling of expensive paper and the sharp metallic tang of justice. And I sat at my desk, which was covered in the final liquidation reports of the Williams estate, feeling a profound sense of mathematical closure that no apology could ever replicate. My firm, Grace Forensic Services, was no longer just a local operation, but a national beacon for the women who had been treated as depreciating assets by men who thought they could trade loyalty for a younger model and a secret offshore account. And as I reviewed the files of my latest expansion into the Atlanta market, I felt the deep, feminine, soulful power of a woman who had used the very stones thrown at her to build a castle that was impenetrable to the reach of predators. I reached out and touched the gold monogrammed pen that Trey had gifted me for my second anniversary of freedom, a pen that felt heavier and more honest than the diamonds Preston used to buy me as a tax-deductible apology for his mounting disrespect, and I knew that every word I wrote with it was a permanent entry in a history that I was finally writing for myself. Before I tell you about the final desperate letter that arrived from the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, where Preston was currently serving his third year of 12, a letter that revealed the ultimate pathetic destination of his remaining ego, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever stood in the quiet of your own home and realized that the silence wasn't a void, but a victory? Because the person who used to fill it with noise was finally and forever silenced by the weight of their own lies. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from today, because your stories of reclamation are the only currency I value in this season of my life. The morning was sharp and clear, and as I drove Leo to his morning swimming lesson, a boy who was now 8 years old and navigating the world with a confidence that made the ground beneath him feel honored, I listened to the sound of his laughter echoing in the car, a sound that I used to have to sign for but was now a vibrant reality that filled every corner of my heart. We pulled up to the Bronzeville Community Center, and as he jumped out and waved his small hand at me, I realized that the $60,000 Preston had stolen was the most expensive mistake he ever made, because it had bought me the clarity to see him as the parasite he truly was. I returned to the office to find Trey waiting for me, his face wearing a look of grim satisfaction that I knew meant the final hammer of the as-is clause had finally landed on the remains of Preston's reputation. Trey informed me that the bank had officially filed a deficiency judgment against Preston for the $3 million shortfall from the Aspen house sale, and because Preston had legally assumed all corporate and personal liabilities without a financial discovery period, He was now personally liable for the entire amount plus interest, which had ballooned to nearly $4.5 million. The government had also successfully traced the crypto keys that Kendall had surrendered, and the $3 million in hidden assets had been officially seized and redirected into the restitution fund for the construction workers and the vendors Preston had stiffed years ago, leaving him with a net worth of exactly zero and a debt that would follow him like a shadow until his final breath. I sat there and listened to the math of his destruction, feeling a strange and beautiful sense of lightness, because I was no longer the one trying to balance his books or protect his name. I was just a woman who had audited a fraud and found that there was nothing left to save. Later that afternoon, I received a phone call from a woman named Beverly, who was the mother of a young woman I had hired as a junior auditor, and she told me through tears that her daughter had just bought her first house using the bonus I had given her, and I realized that the matriarch's grace was not just about my own rising, but about the rising of every woman I could reach with the power of a fair wage and an honest ledger. My phone buzzed with an email from the federal prosecutor's office containing the scanned copy of Preston's final appeal, which had been summarily dismissed by the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, citing the as-is clause as a legally binding assumption of risk that could not be overturned by a claim of emotional duress. The prosecutor mentioned that Preston had broken down in court when the ruling was read, realized that his last chance to ever hold a dollar of his own was gone, and that his mother, Beatrice, had been barred from the building after she tried to assault a court clerk for misplacing her family's dignity. I felt no pity for either of them, because a forensic auditor knows that every debt has a due date, and they were simply the recipients of a bill that had been 7 years in the making. I spent the evening at home, sitting on the porch, watching the snow settle on the trees of Bronzeville, feeling a deep soul-stirring peace that was grounded in the reality of my own sovereign worth. And as Leo came out and sat next to me, leaning his head against my shoulder, I knew that the matriarch's grace was finally mine to wear, like a crown that would never tarnish. My husband had taken everything in the divorce. At least that was the story he told himself to survive the night. But he had actually taken the noise, the lies, the debt, and the worthless red painting that was now gathering dust in a federal evidence locker, while I had taken the only things that could never be appraised: my son's voice, my own integrity, and a future that was finally and gloriously in the black. I was 33 years old, and I was the owner of a firm that helped women find their voices, and a mother to a son who could hear the heartbeat of the world, and the balance sheet of my life was finally and perfectly in alignment. I spent the final hours of the night drafting a new partnership agreement for Grace Forensic Services, because I was expanding to 5 more cities, and I wanted to ensure that every office was led by a woman who had been treated as a foundation and had decided to become a skyscraper instead. The audit was complete, the books were closed, and the silence of my new life was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, because it was the sound of a woman who finally knew her own worth and refused to let a single cent of it be stolen ever again. I am Nia, and I am sovereign, and as the moon rose over the Lake Michigan shoreline, I knew that the matriarch's grace was the only legacy I would ever need to leave behind, because the truth always balances out in the end, and I was finally and forever free. The $5 million debt was his, the trust was mine, and the future was a cinematic masterpiece that I was finally directing with my own steady hand and a heart that was no longer bleeding, but reigning in the light of the truth. I looked at the stars and I whispered thank you to the bricks my grandfather had laid and the math my grandmother had taught me, because they were the only things that never lied, and they were the only things that brought me home to myself in the end. The third anniversary of my liberation arrived not with a celebration, but with a deep and resonant stillness that filled the rooms of my Bronzeville brownstone, like the amber light of a fading sun. And as I sat in my library, surrounded by the legacy of a man, my grandfather, who had known the value of a single brick, I realized that the audit of Nia Williams was finally complete, and the balance sheet was more than just a collection of numbers. It was a testament to the unyielding power of a woman who had stopped subsidizing her own destruction. I was 33 years old, and the world now saw me as a titan of forensic justice, a woman who could peel back the layers of a $30 million fraud with the same calm precision I used to fold my son's laundry. But inside, I was simply a mother who had learned that the most expensive thing you can ever give a man is your silence in the face of his disrespect. The $5 million debt that Preston had tried to chain to my ankles was now a historical footnote in a federal case study, a cautionary tale that was taught in law schools about the lethal combination of a narcissist's ego and a forensic auditor's pen. And as I looked at the final report from Trey regarding the permanent closure of the Williams estate, I felt a profound sense of mathematical peace that no diamond or mansion could ever provide. Preston was currently serving his fourth year of 12 in a cell where the only real estate he controlled was the narrow strip of linoleum between his bed and the bars. And I heard through the legal grapevine that he had spent his last bit of commissary credit trying to buy a stamp to send a letter to a woman who no longer existed, a version of me that he had forged in his own mind to serve as his eternal safety net. I received a final package from the federal evidence locker that morning, a small cardboard box containing the remains of the items that the government didn't deem valuable enough to auction. And as I opened it and saw the hideous red painting, the crimson blur looking even more pathetic and smeared in the harsh light of my reality, I felt a burst of genuine laughter bubble up in my throat, because the federal appraiser had attached a final note stating that the canvas wasn't even real oil paint, but a mass-produced acrylic print on cheap polyester. Preston had traded his son, his wife, his home, and his freedom for a $45 piece of decorative trash, because he was so blinded by the need to win that he never stopped to ask what he was actually fighting for. And as I walked the painting to the alleyway and placed it in the dumpster, I felt the final thread of his toxicity snap and drift away into the cold Chicago wind. I returned to my office at the Monadnock building, where the hallway smelled of fresh coffee and the quiet, unshakable industry of a dozen women who were now working for Grace Forensic Services, each of them a survivor in their own right. Each of them a matriarch who had decided to become a skyscraper instead of a foundation. My newest partner, a woman named Simone, had just returned from a high-level deposition in London where she had successfully recovered $10 million for a widow whose husband had tried to hide her own inheritance in a maze of shell companies in the British Virgin Islands. And as we sat together in my office looking at the sunset over the lake, I felt the deep, feminine, soulful power of a collective rise that was finally and gloriously in the black. Leo was waiting for me at home, his voice now a vibrant and clear melody that filled the house with the colors of his mind, and he told me that evening as he sat at the piano that he wanted to compose a symphony for the wind, because the wind was the only thing that didn't need a voice to be heard. I held him close and whispered that he was the only melody I ever needed to hear. And as I looked at his bright, hearing eyes, I realized that the $60,000 Preston had stolen was the seed money for a miracle that he was too small to witness. I spent the final hours of the night sitting in my library drafting the first chapter of my book, which I titled The Matriarch's Grace, because I wanted the world to know that the strength of an African American woman is not a resource to be mined by predators, but a sovereign kingdom to be respected by those who have earned the privilege of a seat at her table. I thought about the centuries of Black women who had held the line and protected the lineage and bled in silence so that their daughters could finally stand in the light of an honest ledger. And I realized that I was the answer to their prayers and the fulfillment of their audits. My husband had taken everything in the divorce. At least that was the lie he told his reflection in the prison glass. But he had actually only taken the noise, the lies, the debt, and the weight of a man who was a bad investment from the very first day, and he had left me with the only things that truly appreciated in value: my integrity, my son, and a future that was finally and perfectly mine to direct. I was 33 and a sovereign queen of my own life, and as I closed the final file on the Williams estate, I wrote the words "account" settled across the cover in bold black ink, and I felt the deep soul-stirring grace of a woman who had finally stopped holding the breath of a ghost and started breathing the air of her own freedom. The audit was over, the balance was perfect, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just survival. I was reigning in the light of the truth, and the cinematic ending of my past was the grand opening of a future that would never fall. I am Nia, and I am the owner of my destiny, and the silence of my home is no longer a void, but the most beautiful sound I have ever heard, because it is the sound of a woman who finally knows she is